Thank everybody for being with us this afternoon. Last month, we concluded our successful Truth, Action, and Reconciliation series. And today, we are overjoyed to reconvene and to start a new series of discussions called Conversations for an Equitable South. The goal of these conversations will be to host in the months ahead conversations that provide a space to discuss the lasting impact that racism has on people and institutions and to inspire action on building racial equity in our communities. So we're going to start this round of great conversations today with a particular focus. But before I begin, I want to just set the scene. We are in the midst of the Derek Chauvin trial, who killed George Floyd. Sometimes pictures speak 1,000 words. And in this one, not only the death of George Floyd, but of an entire history of oppression across America that has blown into full view. It's been there for many, many times. This past week, Governor Brian Kemp stood in a closed locked room surrounded by a bunch of white men with a picture of a plantation behind him, signing voter suppression laws while an African-American woman lawmaker tried to get in the door and she was arrested trying to raise her voice. In this context, it's absolutely clear that white people have a responsibility to speak about racism, white men in particular. We've talked about that and we'll do that more. But today, we want to begin the conversation on the role that white women can play in the fight towards racial justice and why they so often do not engage. Over the next few weeks, we'll come back to this theme as we explore the convergence of race, of gender, of privilege, with the hopes of inspiring white women in the South to use their power, their persuasion, their privilege to advance racial equity. I am overjoyed today and excited to be joined by a fantastic human being, a great author, a great activist, Jenna Arnold, who's going to help us set the stage for these conversations. Jenna is the author of Raising Our Hands: How White Women Can Stop Avoiding Hard Conversations, Start Accepting Responsibility, and Find Our Place on the Front Lines. This is the book. It is a fantastic book. I commend it to you, and we'll talk a little bit about it. So today, Jenna, thank you for being with us. I'm so excited that you've decided to join us today.
I'm really excited to be here too, Mitch. Thanks for taking the time and making space for this conversation.
Well, I wanted, in the book I just held up, people, you can see it. There's actually a quote on the top of it from Angela Fry. It says, "It's white people's responsibility to bring other well-intended white people to the social justice work of our time." Both you and I have heard from African Americans screaming at the top of their lungs that they're exhausted, that they don't think they ought to be having to explain to or tell or teach white people about how to be in this space, that it's white people's responsibility to deal with racism because white people, for the most part, have the power, the persuasion, the privilege. You really kind of stepped into this space in a very thoughtful way. And so I wanted you to just begin by giving us a bit of understanding of your background and what inspired you to take on this work.
Thank you for that question. And admittedly, Mitch, I'm still trying to figure out why I chose this specific lift, because it's intimidating and it's scary and it's a lightning rod in like a hailstorm, hurricane type thing. And it's enough to make me want to sit back on the sidelines and return to whatever Netflix series I'm binge watching at the moment. And but it directly has come from friends of mine, activists who have been on the front lines, who represent a vast diversity of marginalized populations, who have said consistently, it is white folks' responsibility to go get white folks. And no one's interested in being gotten per se. And I didn't really understand what that meant until I was standing on the stage in 2017, January 21st, 2017, the day of the Women's March. And I was looking out at a sea of pink hats, and qualitatively, just from my observation, it felt like most of the folks that were there were white women. And I couldn't quite add up how all the people I was seeing matched up with that exit poll data that came out from the New York Times after the 2016 election that said 51% of American white women voted for Donald Trump. And sort of trying to back into my upbringing of being surrounded by a tremendous amount of well-intended, good women who had raised me with a set of morals and ethics. you help a drowning child, you help an old lady cross the street, you be kind to yourself and to others. But it just wasn't adding up. These political decisions that were being made, these consumer habits that were being made, this silence and opting out of having difficult conversations, whether it's about recycling or like human trafficking. There was a big beast that I couldn't quite wrap my arms around. So I decided to crisscross the country, having closed-door conversations with American white women, asking existential questions about power and purpose and privilege and what does legacy mean and how has America failed you? And, you know, questions that are hard for humans to navigate, but I wanted to know how white women in this exact moment on this page in our history were navigating some of these very identity-based questions, because I was struggling with it.
Well, I want to ask you about a little bit more about that in a second, but I want to really kind of ask you to focus in on why then. I mean, you've been around for a while, you've been involved in the women's movement. What pricked your conscience? What made you begin to see that what you weren't seeing was the whole picture? What made you really, for the moment, stop? Because a lot of people were at that march too and didn't do what you're doing right now. So do you know what it particularly was and when the moment is you decided to find out more and to step into this responsibility?
A couple of things. One is sort of the annoying, I can't really measure existential moment where I saw one of Toni Morrison's quotes, which I think I've probably seen many times in my life, that said, write the books you need to read. It came when I heard from a friend and fellow activist, Tamika Mallory, stand at the podium at the Women's March and say, our chains still have not been taken off. And what I heard was her ancestors from her bone marrow speaking to us. And then sort of just like the basic algorithmic math, like how can so many people I love just casually pull the lever for something that I feel is so fundamentally against their best interests, against humanity's best interest, and then casually go to Costco. Like it was just this absolute tipping point of, you know, an animalistic mammal-based fear. Mitch, it's my favorite thing to do, ask people why they marched in 2017, and I've yet to see or hear a like very cohesive, comprehensive answer, because I think most people showed up on the streets that day worldwide. 5 million folks showed up on the streets that day worldwide because something in us is saying something is very, very not right. And I do say specifically about this time, and I appreciate you framing this conversation about what's happening this hour of this day, that we're not going to be able to understand what's happening now for another 10 years or another 25 years from now. So to try to figure out that exact moment, I just couldn't sit around and longer.
Well, you did take an action. And what's so interesting to me is our organization, EPU, did the same thing. We traveled around the South for about a year and a half. We went to 13 different states. We went to 30 counties. We talked to over 1,000 people. And in the process of writing your book, you did the same thing. You felt this need, this desire to talk to people, to hear them, to try to understand them. And you particularly were talking to white women. And I'm interested in you telling us a little bit more about those conversations and what you heard, what you learned, what you think that you intuited, and maybe what suggestions you have to women about how to respond in this space and in this moment that we're called in.
What I heard, I heard a number of surprising things, and then I heard a lot of language and words that confirmed hypothesis that I had. One of the surprising statements that kept coming up, or this conclusion I was able to draw based on the conversation, were things that I had heard from, again, activists on the front lines for decades, who would often point out that liberal white folks can be considered dangerous because they'll make excuses for, oh, we voted for a Black president, so racism is like then, or I donate my money here, so I'm philanthropic, and, you know, checking that social issue, social justice box. And then and to me, I carry that with me, because I do happen to find that folks who might be infuriated about the state of the world, but they're not having those courageous conversations with their sons or their husband's bosses. And so they are white liberals, can be considered, as Martin Luther King has said, very dangerous. It's why he didn't quote unquote mess with them, because he didn't really believe them. They were very performative in his eyes. And I found the same thing. The second thing that I think was most disheartening, but also an accurate reflection of where I was and still am, because I think it's both human, but also a bit of like the great American myth curse, is that a lot of women didn't believe they were worthy enough to step in, that there was a lack of belief in capacity to give, that there was insecurity in every lane. One of the examples I use all the time is about this woman who is a gun-loving, gun-owning woman who is still shrieking inside about what's happening in our grocery stores or in our first grade classrooms or on the south side of Chicago, saying, well, I don't understand gun show loopholes or background checks, so I can't really step into the conversation about safer guns at the gun club. And it's because our academic system has told us that we have to get, if we don't get an A, we're not good enough. If we're not the captain of the varsity team, we're not good enough. Like, there's all these levels. If you're not the boss, you're not good enough. If you're not making this income, you're not good enough. So you have to there's this belief that you have to be some level of perfect to step into this work. And that is probably, Mitch, why I didn't step into it sooner. Because who am I? Who am I? And that is an American, beautifully crafted, let's leave it to the men in power because they know, right? And this myth of like, this imposter syndrome, that language is 8 years old, 10 years old now, but it's like everyone's lived by it for all of eternity. Just white men have like been given the freedom to actually pretend, and white women not so much. So it was both like how they make excuses for not stepping into the complicatedness, the desire and desperation to keep things harmonized and dance around issues so as like to keep things peaceful. And then what was most heartbreaking to me, and I was most connected to, was this belief that I'm not worthy enough to actually engage and no one really wants me here.
So what changed? I mean, you evidently found out who you were and you found out what your worth was. How did you, I think that you're describing what you heard and what you saw. Were you able to glean from all of those conversations, all of the listening that you did, what a pathway was for women? Let me just read. This is again on the front cover of your book. How white women can stop avoiding hard conversations, start accepting responsibility, and find our place on the new front lines. Were you able to come up with really kind of a toolbox, a courageous capacity, if you will, or some kind of insights to help women really understand what role they have historically played, and then, of course, what they can do to fix the problem? Because you also say, and let me read this, this is very powerful language, raising our hands is based on the premise that American white women are perhaps the most powerful demographic group in the United States and around the world, and that white women must do more to translate their privilege. The American white woman is a powerful force, an essential participant to mobilize on behalf of humanity and our planet. But based on what I have heard and saw in listening circles, I am not sure they know it. And so what is the pathway from where we are to exciting that energy and having women assume the responsibility and the power to change it?
It's a dual knowing, and they're totally in contradiction with each other.
Talk about that for a second.
But they like also perfectly fit together. So I was disheartened because again, like, who am I to step in now? When I look around me and I'm surrounded by tremendously strong, intelligent, compassionate women from like in every spectrum and lane of my life. And I don't think I'm any less more than that or them. And so there's this belief of there's this need of mine, and I did this in chapter 1 where I talk about the contradiction of silence, in chapter 2 this like American blueprint that you have to check off from, like, you know, being cool enough to sit at the whatever table you want at the cafeteria, to, like, you know, getting engaged and the wedding, and then the pregnancy, and are you going to work or stay at home, like those, that blueprint that like most folks I know are familiar enough if they haven't followed it to some degree. So it's like, I first have to say, hey, this happened historically. Like, this is what the Barbie houses told us. This is what the patriarchy, this is came down from the church. This is what came here. This did it, right? So this is why you might look at the world the way you do. And then this is how the world told you to look at yourself, which is like, unless you're perfect, shh, right? And so I have to first remind everyone that, like, imperfection, I only want imperfect people here. We need all the imperfect people here. So the knowing that, like, everyone has to show up right now. And then the second knowing is the complete opposite of that, which is you need to show up not knowing what to do. And this is where it, like, people are confused by, but it's where I think white folks in general need to reposition themselves, because sometimes our tendency has been in the past to, like, step in and grab the bull by the horns and, like, you know, find the solution when we might not be the ones closest to the problem, so therefore we're not the solution. So I have found that there's the knowing that you should be comfortable in the not knowingness of what to do next, right? That the not knowingness about everything from the crisis in Yemen to the crisis in Western China to what is it that we're going to do about our semi-automatic weapons to Medicare versus Medicaid. Like, I don't know any of this either, but there is so much freedom in the not knowing, but the leaning in. Yeah. And, you know, right after George Floyd's murder a year ago, there was so much discussion around defunding the police. And a friend of mine who's been on the front lines of that for decades posted a 13-point plan on how to reallocate resources that go to law enforcement elsewhere. So she posted it on Monday, and then, like, on Wednesday I went to go repost it and I couldn't find it on her feed, and I texted her and I'm like, hey, where's that thing I want to repost it? She's like, oh, I pulled it down because I think step 7 and step 9 need a little bit more fleshing out. Now, traditionally I would have been like, she doesn't know. We don't know what to do. And I would, like, convince myself to go back to the corner of, like, you know, and start flipping through Instagram, you know, wedding cakes, and I'm not even getting married. And instead I'm leaning in saying, okay, they don't know yet. Let's see. Let's see what happens. I'm here at the ready. I'm ready and waiting. And I think there's this desire to, like, what's the turnkey solution? Folks, right. There is.
So what did she do? What did you guys decide to do? Repost it?
Well, I just waited for her to, like, figure out the plan. She reposted it like a month later, and then I posted it.
Excellent.
And who even knows if that's the right pathway? But that's the point, is that I find constantly that we're, you know, my deep concern, and I do, Mitch, admittedly have moments where I'm like, we're not getting out of this, is how quick everyone, particularly when it comes to guns, what happened a week ago, you know, that everyone is suddenly, like, reverts to the polls, right? Here's the NRA talking points, but, you know, guns are horrible, versus leaning in saying, what are we going to do, folks? You want to be able to hunt? Okay, let's find a way around this. Wait, you want to have protection at home? Let's find a way around this. And so instead of it being like the why, my friend Simon Sinek, who came up with the whole concept of why, I'm like, okay, I'm over the why. I want to know the how. And let's just lean into the how. And no one has to be perfect. Right. So know you're needed, and then know you know nothing.
Well, that is an excellent point. When I was a mayor, I would obviously have a lot of problems, and people would always come and tell me what the problem was. And I would always say, I don't really need to know what the what is. I know that already, and I already know the why. I need to know the how. So can we come up with solutions? So I don't think that's necessarily, you can't blame that just on women. I think human beings are, but I'm interested in this though. When you were, so you traveled around, you talked to a lot of people. When you finished and you were by yourself in a moment of discernment, were you thinking that, you know what, people can be changed? We can actually do this? Did you feel that women were having a deeper and a better feeling about being able to assert their power in this moment, or better yet, an incredible need that history's calling them to that only they can do, or not?
Both, yes, all of the above. What really stood out for me is there was this significant desire for people to continue to be in community with each other as they were trying to figure out what to do next. And sometimes these listening circles were scheduled for 2 hours. They were always at like the 5-hour, 6-hour mark if I would let them that long. So people were like, can we come back next Tuesday? And so what people want is to be in community with people as we collectively try to solve these great problems. And so it's not that they were changed in terms of like, see you on the front lines. It was like, I want in on this because this is where I can also find my salvation. This is where I also find my purpose. And, I want a legacy, even if it's just making someone's life a teeny bit better, And so this idea of, did they change? No, but I think I opened the gate to the white picket fence enough for them to like elbow their way through.
Yeah. Well, at EPU, we talk a lot about the need for a full and complete understanding of a reckoning with our country's history in order to create the conditions for meaningful change on the issues that we're talking about. So have you been able to come to an understanding of what role white women in history and in various movements have played? We talked about Dr. King's concern about liberals, conservative women, liberal women throughout the South, all in this context of white. Did you sense that they had any real understanding about the totality of our history, or do you think that they really lacked a full and complete understanding of the depth of it?
The latter.
Mm-hmm.
The latter. I mean, but that I don't, and this is where like it gets into careful territory for somebody like me saying something like this. Listen, if you have access to the World Wide Web or a public library, you have no excuse not to know what other folks might interpret history as, right? I mean, the
Right.
research there, but the way that we talk about this country, it's like a well-filtered Instagram account with like,
Right.
like all the perfect filters and only the good angles, because victors get to tell their stories. So our textbooks haven't, our schools haven't, but this is true for every country around the world. I mean, it's fascinating to look at how textbooks in just Europe cover World War II. I mean, our
Right.
story about what happened in the Vietnam War looks a lot different than the way that the Vietnamese talk about the American War, right?
I think that's right. People like Brian Stevenson have taught us a lot about narrative, and of course, people of color have been yelling at the top of their lungs that again, we're exhausted in having to explain to you that you have access to all the information in the world that you need, and how history is told, and how much you remember of it, and what you decide to think about. The Tulsa riots, for example, most Americans didn't understand white men and women. And so I agree with you there. And I'm sorry.
But they know Auschwitz, right? Like there is this really, whose story gets told when and at what point. It is a national state standard, a federal state standard to teach what we did to the indigenous in 2nd grade and then enslavement in 4th grade. You tell me, Mitch, how many details can we get into when we're talking to 7-year-olds and 9-year-olds about genocide?
Yeah. You make an excellent point. I want to talk to you about conflicts that women have about working in the professional workforce, balancing that with their roles as mothers. One of the things that comes up is the work and the role that women play in our families. In the wake of George Floyd's murder, we saw groups of white mothers compelled to step forward in protest. People remember George Floyd laying on the ground, actually invoking his mother's name. And I want to explore this with you. What do you think about the role of white mothers in the social justice movement from that perspective? Is it enough to appeal to a sense of moral obligation here, or is there something deeper to move them in to, as you said, using their power and their persuasion to act?
Yes. I had my first epiphany around the power of American mothers after the Indonesian tsunami and the amount of money that we raised for that region. And then again, I saw it after the earthquake in Haiti. And then again, I saw it when American Idol was a thing. And every season they had an episode that was Idol Gives Back, and they would raise like $190 million an episode. And like, I knew that wasn't the dads giving the credit card to the 12-year-old to text the number. And I knew that that was the moms. And you also saw it with separation at the border in June, significant heartbreak right now. But babies aren't being separated from moms. I think that's a really important distinction. But, you saw all of the mothers rage around this idea of protecting a species when they see the story. Now, Bravo's not telling the story. Our news certainly isn't giving full, glimpses as to what's happening in Yemen or, what's happening with the indigenous or what's been happening with indigenous women and children. So, but I do think, and this is like, I found the data when I dove into it, that American women control 85% of the US economy. That is larger than like 40 countries in Africa combined. It's larger than India's economy. And this is like our toothpaste and whether or not we're buying the van or the SUV. Like the amount of influence these women have and don't know is extraordinary, which is why going back to that first, like, what now is like, I need you to know that the power of your dollar is very significant. The power of your vote, American white women are going to be the largest voting bloc through 2060. Through 2060, they're still going to control 57 Senate seats. Yeah.
Well, those are great points. And they have political power, they have economic power, maybe beyond what they anticipate. But in this instance, my sense is that white men are going to be the last ones that come along. They're the hardest to get to. But white mothers also raise white boys. And so what is that? This is a much more personal and sensitive issue. I think about the Daughters of the Confederacy being the ones that actually put the Confederate monuments up and cultivated this idea of the lost cause. And I wonder, where are the Daughters of the Confederacy? What are we doing, all of us, mothers and fathers, really, about raising our sons to really understand, and daughters, where we are, knowing what we should have known and stepping forward when we shouldn't have? Is this a moment where we say to them, the world really can't go forward unless we get this right, notwithstanding what else we're talking about? My guess is that you think women are going to play a very large role, or have to, in fact, if it's going to get done.
Particularly in how we're raising our sons, right? It is so, women are, I believe, survivors when it comes to sexual assault, believe survivors, very much protecting women until it's her son. And then it's how short was her skirt? How much did she drink? And that is truly, like, when I see an active shooter, when I hear about a horrific rape case, I mean, my head goes back to, where is that mother? Because women are responsible for raising white women raise the next generation of white boys. And I'm so grateful you're here, Mitch, to hold white men accountable, because I can scream at the top of my lungs about misogyny, They will not listen to me. It has to come from another man. And so this idea of like moms holding moms accountable, holding each other accountable. And, there's an image, there was a spray painted image on a city block that's not clear, but God, it is just, it says, when he called out for his mama, he was calling all of them. It's something like that. And it's true. I mean, like, moms rose from the ground, because I think there's a responsibility we have for all babies, not just our own. And maybe that's the bleeding heart in me, but like, Mitch, I would take your kids in an instant now and even know how many you have.
Well, I have a lot of them, but thank you. Do you think conservative women are going to respond to this? Do you think liberal women are more likely to respond than conservative women? Because whiteness,
But no, and here's why. So I was doing some listening circle work in Wyoming, reddest state, most conservative state in the country. And I had a listening circle, and reproductive rights came up. Abortion, guns, always come up, always come up. And I try to steer the conversation away from it because like, I don't want to get into the nuances of that because they'll stop talking because I'll lay out my case if I have to. And so we had a listening circle, and then like 3 ladies chased me to my rental car afterward. And they were like, yo, are you here tomorrow morning? Can we do another one? And I was like, why? And she's like, well, because we're actually pro-choice, but we lied in there about being anti-abortion. And I was like, oh yeah, I want to talk to you. So I pushed my flight back. We met at the hotel lobby. I'm like, what's up? They're like, we have to pretend like we are anti-abortion, but we'd be the first ones to get our 16-year-old kid on a plane to go to any state she needed to, even if we needed to send them with miles. So yes, do I believe that there are some women who are like, no, my cubs? Sure. And like, don't drag me into the conversation around like your kid's drowning and another kid's drowning. Who do you say first? Like, I don't have time for that. But like, I am running into a burning school for every kid. I'm making sure every kid has the apple, so like that, and that's our humanness, and that's who America is, and that is what it is that we are about. So yeah, I'm going to say that like, it's definitely in our 51% favor, but I'm going to push that up to like the mid.
All right, look, you've been fantastic. We're getting close to the end, and the audience has asked a question that they'd like to know the answer to that could be very helpful. And the question is, are there resources, articles, memoirs that have helped you as a white woman in your anti-racist work, or that have helped you better understand life experiences outside of your own privilege that they could look to for help?
Yeah, I would say any author that represents a different life experience than yours is important. But the reason I wrote this book, again, is because I needed a little bit more of a 101. Like, I wasn't able to jump into Baldwin or Toni Morrison without the full context of understanding, again, like the role that Full House played in my understanding of the state of the world. And like, so I needed a bit of a primer before I got into it, which is what I think this might be for some folks. But I mean, listen, Baldwin finds me like, etched on mirrors in public bathrooms, and I'm loving Morrison right now. For those of us who are particularly not lazy, but like, I appreciated it. I made a site on my website, jennaarnold.com. I think it's like /resources or something. And I have all of the people who have significant handles on Twitter or Instagram who post the stuff that I need to see in between the photos of my nieces and nephews. And their links are there. So all you have to do is like click follow, click follow, click follow, click follow, click follow. But yeah.
All right, well, that's good. Also on unumfund.org, we have a reading list if people are interested in delving into it. All right, look, we got 2 minutes and 30 seconds left, and I want to end this with a very poignant story that you tell in your book about having never known your father's mother for a lot of different reasons. But I want to ask you this because the issue is, when should people do things? And as I mentioned earlier, I always tell my kids now would be a good time to do whatever it is that you're doing. So why don't you tell us that story really quickly, and what lessons it taught you about how to grab the moment that's in front of you?
My father was adopted at birth, and I'm so grateful to you. Like, you really read that. And no one in an interview has asked me about that story. And it's probably one of the most significant ones, at least in the last decade of my life. My father, so thank you, Mitch. My father was adopted at birth, and my cousin Tina Braun, who I know is watching, helped me find his biological family. And we learned that his mother was living in Providence, exactly 3 hours and 27 minutes away from my front door in Manhattan. And between my dad and my cousin and I, we decided we were going to wait a little bit. We were going to wait till the spring. And when my dad, who lives abroad, came home before I went and saw her, and I didn't need anything from this woman. I just sort of needed to touch her hand and see if I could see myself in her, and take something from the fact that she's made it and survived, and know that I can tell myself that you're going to make it and you're going to survive too, because I still need that every night while I'm falling asleep. And so we didn't, because we were performing what we thought would be right and most convenient and easy and what would be the protocol. And after 97 years, or in her case, 60 years of wondering what happened to the son that she gave up for adoption, which I imagine any mother would just constantly be, is he safe? Is he happy? Is he safe? Is he happy? Is he safe? Is he happy? And me just wanting to say, he was safe and happy. We got a phone call that she died. So 2 weeks after learning about her being alive and well in this one home, 2 weeks later, we found out she passed away, and I collapsed. Like, I could still even cry now. And because we were so bothered with logistics and performance and what was appropriate, we didn't get in the car and drive the 3 hours and 27 minutes to touch her hand. And that is how I feel about, truly, Mitch, everything in the world. And yesterday, I spent the day talking about Uyghurs. The day before that, it was gun control. The day before that, it was Yemen. Like, it is just, there are too many other moms and other children wondering, where are you? They know that we have the resources. They know that we have the capacity, and we just have opted out of making space in our lives to lean in and to wait for answers and then get behind those answers, or say, that doesn't make sense. What about this? And we don't have time. And I ended the book with the most powerful sentence I think exists in the book, which is, go now. And truly, go now. We're waiting for you. They're waiting for you. Forget Mitch and I. They're waiting for you. And thank you.
Jenna, thank you so much. That was a very wonderful and provocative discussion. White people in America, racism is our problem. We have the power, we have the persuasion, we have the access to funds, we have the access to the government. It's our responsibility to save it. Our African-American brothers and sisters have asked us, they have begged us. It's not on them, it's on us. And thank you for the conversation about white women. Obviously, white men have more in this than anybody, and they need to be addressed directly. That we continue to act badly, and the thousands of examples that we will cite over time. But Jenna, thank you so much for writing the book. Thank you so much for accepting the responsibility to step into this space and be vulnerable enough to share what it is that you thought you knew that you might not know, not waiting to be perfect, not waiting to have all of the answers, understanding the conflicts that women feel in their lives, being torn in two different directions at once, but yet taking the step that was necessary. And at the end of the day, doing it now. So all you guys, thank you all so much for joining us. We'll see you next time.